This video is talking about the chapter Abolition Feminism and Utopian Justice, Speculative Visionary Fiction and the End of Gendered Violence, which is published in the Research Handbook on Gender, Violence and Law that's edited by Nikki Godden-Rasul and Lucia Kula. I'm Ruth Houghton.
I'm Nikki Godden-Rasul.
I'm Aoife O'Donoghue.
And I'm Sara Vincenzotti.
So this project and the chapter that emerges from it comes from a very real sense that the labelling of abolition feminism as utopian was working to marginalise and ultimately dismiss the critiques of carceral institutions being made by abolitionists. This is similar to how utopian is used as a prerogative label to minimise the legitimacy of feminist and other marginalised people's claims for radical constitutional and political change. This calls for a revision of what utopia is and what it can mean to bring utopian thinking into legal research. And this necessitates a truly cross-disciplinary endeavour that brought together Nikki's expertise in abolition feminism, Sara's love of speculative fiction, and Ruth and Aoife's work on utopian methods in law. Because one way to conceive of utopia is as a method, and then to use that method to interrogate how law constructs society. Given that speculative visionary fiction is used to envisage worlds without prisons, patriarchy, heterosexism, racism, capitalism, ecocide, and the focus on world building speaks to and informs the part of abolition and social justice movements' work, understanding utopia as a method in abolitionist work was a much better way for us to understand the intersections between utopia and abolitionist thought.
In the chapter, we then start by exploring abolition feminism in a little more detail and the critiques of carceral institutions, which include but aren't limited to policing, prisons, immigration detention and psychiatric hospitals, and their inherent violent entanglements with the reproduction of cis heteropatriarchy, white supremacy, capitalism, poverty and other harmful life orderings. Abolition feminism draws out the gender dimensions of carceral institutions and punitive logics, showing how punitive systems reproduce rather than address gendered violence. Crucially, abolition feminists put considerable energy into creating alternative ways of responding to violence, so that, as Angela Davis puts it, the police and criminal legal system become obsolete. And as Ruth has talked about, it's this alternative world building that places abolitionist work into conversation with utopian thinking.
As Ruth and Nikki have already outlined, abolition feminism is often presented as utopian. And this really marries with the types of critiques that the use of utopias as political theory very often gets. This is because utopias are seen as unrealistic blueprints that reflect colonial conquest. And that in part is true. If we think of Thomas More's utopia, probably the most famous one, that is, it begins with the elimination of the indigenous population. Many of them have been used as imperial blueprints for the conquests of the Americas, Australia, Africa. So there is a real history of the use of utopianism as a tool of conquest, of domination, of racialization, and of gendered violence. However, to only see utopias in that sense is to forget the work, the long-standing work of many feminists, African American, particularly feminist scholars, but also scholars such as Wakina Hussain, who is an Indian scholar from the early 1900s, writing about other ways of doing utopias, and particularly the critical feminist utopias of the 1970s, which entirely eschew blueprints that understand utopias as not end state. You never actually get to the utopia itself because it is always iterative, it is always changing to reflect the society in which, and the people and the very lived experiences of the people who actually inhabit that utopia. Ruth Levitas, in her very well-known work on utopias, talks about using utopia as method, and there's several parts of her work, but in our chapter we use the architectural mode, and in that you recognize and identify the utopias that are all around us. We all live in a utopia. Constitutionalism, criminal systems are based on idealized ideas, often from white cis heteronormative men, basically. And so Levitas requires us to look at those, to see those utopian workings in our existing systems, because utopianism has been used to produce the political orders. But also, as part of that, to look at the kind of critical abolitionist utopias that do exist as a way to prefigure another way of being, as a political exercise, as speculative and visionary fiction nearly in all instances are a form of political theory that presents another way and allows us to work through how other way of being could exist.
So in the chapter, we take Ruth Levitas's forms of utopia as method and interrogate canonical utopian texts to find the ways in which they constructed ideas of place, and in particular ideas of putting people in their place adjacent with questions that abolitionist scholars have raised. And then secondly, we look at the work of visionary fiction and abolition science fiction to think about those ways of doing the world differently. So under that archaeological mode, what we did was we looked at early modern canonical utopian texts, and we interrogated the ways in which they used racial hierarchies and gendered violence to construct their utopian worlds. We thought about Neville's The Isle of Pines, as well as Francis Bacon's New Atlantis, in which there are techniques of enclosure and putting people in their place to kind of first construct a no place before we're then able to build this ideal utopian world. And we contrasted that then using the architectural mode of Levitas to look at some of the stories within the work of abolition science fiction, a collection by Phil Crockett Thomas, where activists are writing these science fiction texts. One in particular is Jess Poyner's short story Day 62 on Earth, in which the idea of utopia here is to understand it as a process, a continual, iterative, ongoing discussion, in which what happens in the story is that Dylan has caused an offence. They are taking part in a healing justice process, and it's told to the reader that actually this is Dylan's second time through the process, which raises questions about whether or not the process needs to change. And actually what the story gets us to think about is that the process hasn't failed per se, but rather there is an ongoing commitment to this iterative process of reflection and reimagination. A kind of crucial part of what Aoife told us is the critical utopia.
So at its core, this chapter concludes that speculative visionary fiction is a crucial tool within the abolitionist toolkit, which enables us to both excavate the exclusions within utopian projects and imagine futures without prisons, patriarchy, and racism. Utopianism and abolition are both about transformation of societies, of what we understand as justice, and of what we are willing to call possible. As authors and educators, we are committed to continuing our unfinished processes of reading, learning, and unlearning from non-canonical utopian texts, in particular Black feminist speculative fiction, as well as bringing them into our utopia reading groups, as well as into our classrooms.
Thanks very much, everyone, for listening, and we hope you enjoy the chapter and the rest of the book.